Hello. So this video is going to be discussing, in proper terms, the first part of Chapter 2, our first set of civilizations that we're going to be discussing here. And those are the city-states of an area that we call Sumer or Sumeria. If you're looking at this map, which admittedly is in German, it's not in English, but you can see exactly the area that we're talking about here. It's a set of city-states that can all be found in between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers to the northwest of the Persian Gulf, basically in what we would call modern-day Iraq. Okay. Most of the cities, the ones that we talk about the most, are places like Uruk and Ur. You might remember Ur from Chapter 1. Nippur, Babylon. These are some of the key areas that we're going to be talking about early on. Okay. So just as I was just saying, this is an area of the world that is found somewhere in southeastern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, just to the northwest of the Persian Gulf. It was settled by humans sometime in 5500 BC or 4000 BC. You don't need to know those dates. And this group of people, the Sumerians, were comprised of about 12 different city-states. Just to give you a sense of how big they were, some of these cities could be around 700 square miles, have a population of about 50,000 people. If you ever have difficulty kind of understanding those numbers, one thing that I like to do is try to figure out how many people can a modern-day sports stadium that I know hold. So for instance, when I was a kid, I used to always go to the Core State Spectrum, and a sold-out crowd at the Core State Spectrum was 14,000 people. So I roughly know that, if a population of a city is about 50,000 people, then I know that that counts as, somewhere between 2 and 4, full Core State Spectrums worth of people. Regardless of the size of the cities, though, all of these different cities shared a similar culture. So the Sumerians were not one united group of people. It was this collection of city-states that all generally had the same culture. But politically, they were not one unified nation. Okay. Imagine, for instance, if the United States, rather than being united together, a group of states, each one was its own little country, right? We would all share American culture, but we would not be united politically. That's exactly the kind of situation that we have here in Sumeria. Now, you may remember, as I said earlier in the previous video, that Mesopotamia is really just a big flat place, a big flat land, no crazy mountain ranges, no big forests. And as a result, that means that they're lacking a lot of resources. Okay, so if you don't have mountains, then you don't have lots of stone and ore for metals. If you don't have big forests, you don't have timber. So the question is then, how did the Sumerians make lives for themselves? And the answer to that is they had to be clever. They had to be creative. And they used the small amount of resources they had and in creative ways. And then the things that they couldn't solve that way, they solved through trade. So if they don't have a lot of timber because there's no forests, they make their homes out of clay, for instance, clay bricks. Or they would then trade. So they would sell their clay bricks, so they would sell whatever materials they did have to get the materials that they need. So we know that they traded extensively. We have evidence for them trading with Egypt and India. But that trade is partially, aside from the fact that it's just a useful thing to do, part of the reason why they were engaged in trade was to make up for their lack of resources, the same way that we would have a city that was built in forests would have lots and lots of timber. A place that doesn't have forests has to come up with a way to deal with that. As a fun little side note, we also know that the Sumerians loved music. A lot of the evidence that we have from them archaeologically and literarily talks a lot about music. So we know that this civilization was very big into music. Well, what did it look like in the different Sumerian cities? Well, each of these city-states had its own ruler, its own king. Okay. And that ruler would either be a sort of priest, which was called an ensi, a political king called the Ugal. Those are your two options, basically. Um, and their job was basically to look out for the well-being of the city. Some of their key things that they had to do were to maintain the public works structures that kept the city thriving, like walls and irrigation, lead armies, enforce the laws, keep track of everything that's being needs to be written down by using scribes. So basically, everything that you would expect from a ruler. These rulers were typically seen as servants or representatives of the gods. This is going to be different from what we see in some other cultures. So, in some cultures, the rulers are gods. In some cultures, the rulers are separate from their gods. And in this culture, we see that the Sumerians believed that their rulers acted like servants of the gods, and they were responsible for making sure that the gods stayed happy with their city. If your city fell out of favor with one of these gods, then that was the ruler's fault. And that would be a really bad thing. It would have repercussions for the ruler. These rulers were hereditary in the sense that they passed on their power from father to son or from generation to generation. And typically, in most of these cities, the rulers started off as priests, but then as time went on and there was this concern for keeping your city safe from attacks, non-priest military rulers took over. And then slowly but surely, those non-priestly, non-religious rulers would find a way to incorporate religion into their rule by some other means. And we'll have examples of that soon. The society, the people that lived in these city-states, lived in a social hierarchy where there was sort of a high class, a middle class, and a lowest class. The highest class would obviously be the ruler of the city and all of their family, any important government officials, important priests. The middle class, which was smaller, typically was lesser versions of the people in the higher class, so lesser priests or lesser government officials like scribes, and also merchants and artisans, these types of people that we talked about in chapter 1. And then the lowest class of people, and probably the biggest class, were peasant farmers. Most of these farmers didn't actually own their own land. That land would be owned by the king, and the people worked on it for the king. In some cultures, most of the farmers own their own land, for instance, in Greece. But here, we don't see that. Now, slaves or enslaved people are also a part of this society. Most of them are people that were enslaved because they were captured in war, either war between the city-states or war with other cultures. But we also know that you could become a slave in the Sumerian civilization through debt, as a criminal punishment, or you could be born into slavery. Okay? What's interesting, though, is not necessarily that there were enslaved people in Sumeria. Pretty much all of the cultures that we talk about this year are going to include enslaved people. Okay. What's unique and what's interesting is, number one, that there were not many of them, which is very rare. In a lot of cultures where there are enslaved people, we end up with really large numbers of them. But here in Sumeria, we actually don't see very many of them. We're told by scholars that there just simply wasn't a lot of space in the economy for them. There wasn't enough money or jobs or availability for these people. But also what's interesting is that most of the enslaved people in Sumeria were other Sumerians. Typically, when ancient cultures enslave people, they enslave people from outside of their own culture. They typically go to war against somebody from outside of their culture, beat them, defeat them, and then enslave them and bring them back into their own culture. Here, though, most of the Sumerian slaves were other Sumerians. And this is different from the pattern that we see in most other ancient societies. So this is very interesting for us, a very unique element something that makes the Sumerian civilization different from what we see elsewhere. The other interesting thing about Sumerian slavery is because most of the slaves were other Sumerians, in being enslaved does not carry the same negative stigma that is often seen with other ancient cultures. When you see other ancient cultures, slaves, for instance, those enslaved people are typically looked at as being less than human or being worse than everybody else, right? In the Sumerian world, enslavement was looked at as sort of like, well, you're kind of just at a low point in your life. You're kind of down on your luck. Something unfortunate happened to you, whether you fell into debt or you got beaten in an army. Your army was defeated, and then that's just a bad situation. But you can get out of it. You can deal with this. You can power through it and then move on, because apparently, in Sumeria, it was very common for slaves to be freed after several years of service. So, if the Sumerians look at enslavement as sort of a temporary thing that happens to you when things just don't go your way, but that's okay because it can be changed and you can be reverted to not being enslaved anymore. This is a very different setup than what we see with other ancient societies where slavery is permanent. Slavery is meaning that you are somehow less than human. Really a different take based on what we expect from other cultures. And I know that might be hard to understand since we haven't talked about any other cultures already. But keep this in mind as we move forward, and you'll be able to see just how unique it is. We always like to talk about women when we talk about these ancient civilizations, because it's one of my, sort of favorite topics is how were women treated or what was life like for women in these different ancient cultures. And as we might expect, based on what we kind of talked about earlier in the year, we see a lot of power and a lot of respect for women in Sumeria. You'll remember that the earlier back you go in human history, the higher status that women have, right? Because we started off as hunter-gatherers, and in the hunter-gatherer society, that Paleolithic period, we have very strong status for women in human culture. And then as farming comes along and men sort of take over as the primary food producers, women start to lose that status. But what this means is that the earlier back you go, as far as a civilization, the earlier a civilization is, the higher status women are going to have in that civilization. And since Sumerian civilization is one of the earliest human civilizations, then we see a lot of power for female figures. Female goddesses are extremely respected in their religion. Women, and that high goddess status is paralleled by what we see with human women in Sumerian society. So we have evidence, for instance, that some of the wives of the Sumerian rulers, even though the rulers themselves were often male, the wives of those rulers would often have some sort of actual supervisory power in government. They actually had some clout. We know that women could write songs and poems, and that might not seem like a big deal, but if a woman can read and write, that means she has high status or high value in society. In a lot of ancient cultures, women don't get any education, right? And reading and writing is part of an education. So the fact that Sumerian women could read and write shows that they were placing value in those women. There are some female rulers of cities too. The ruler of Kish in 2600 BC was a woman named Azag-Bau. And not only was she a ruler of the city, but she was also a tavern keeper. She ran a tavern. She ran a business. So she's running a business and running a city as its ruler. And even more interestingly, women could engage in business in their own names. Women were actually allowed to run businesses, have jobs, and they didn't just have to hide in the back. So in other cultures, for instance, like Greece, for instance, women were not allowed to own property. And there's no way that a woman could run a business. But here in Sumeria, women are allowed to do that. So we really see some interesting high status level power for women in Sumerian civilization. Of course, it's not all great. Women in Sumeria never had legal rights that were equal to men's, so that's always a problem. And even though early on we do have some powerful females in the ruling class of Sumerian civilizations, eventually men basically take over. So the earlier you go back, the better things are for women. And since Sumeria is a very early civilization, we see that. But over time, the pattern of men taking over definitely holds true. One of the biggest things, though, about Sumerian civilization was their religion. Basically, their daily lives revolved around their religion. Okay. And the reason for that was the Sumerians believed that their main job, their most important thing that they could do, was to ensure that the gods were kept happy. They had to make sure that the gods were happy. And we'll see why that is in just a second. But if your society's main job, main goal is to make sure that the gods are happy, then clearly religion is going to not only be important, but it's going to basically permeate everything you do in your life as a Sumerian. And some of this stuff happens in really interesting ways that we don't expect. For instance, each city was dedicated to a specific god or goddess. And you might say, well, why would you do that? And the idea was, well, if each city has its own special god, then no god can be upset that they're not getting their worship because there's an entire city dedicated to worshiping this one god. Okay? And the way that they showed that was through, all sorts of ways. But one of the most famous is that they would build these gigantic ziggurats, these basically almost like pyramid structures that were topped with a temple. And that god's temple would be at the top of that ziggurat, and it would always be the biggest structure in the city. Wherever the people looked around, they would see this gigantic building, and it would remind them that the god was very important. So very crucial to keep the god happy, and they would dedicate their cities, both physically and mentally, towards making these gods happy. This culture is a polytheistic culture, that is a multi-god culture where multiple gods are worshipped. And as we expect, these were originally nature gods that took on city god elements. They were gods of nature that then eventually added human activities to their portfolios. So they ruled over every aspect of life. They were the real rulers of the cities, and the kings and all were just the servants of those gods. These gods were anthropomorphic, which means human-shaped. And that includes both looking like humans, but also acting like humans. So they have, houses, and they eat food, and they, have families. It's not just that they look like humans, but they act like humans. They were immortal, which means that they lived forever, and they had magic powers. This would be very similar to the gods that you might know from Greek or Roman mythology. If you know anything about Greek and Roman mythology and the way that those gods act, that's kind of the same way that the gods act here in Sumeria. They're responsible for everything in life, both good and bad. Okay. And what we know is that according to the stories, they really didn't care about people at all. They weren't really very interested in people. In fact, some of the stories that the Sumerians tell show that the gods were almost unnecessarily cruel to humans. For instance, the most famous story is that the Sumerian gods were upset that humans were making too much noise, and so they flooded the whole world to kill all the humans just because they were making too much noise. And if you think that your gods would kill everybody just because some people were making a lot of noise, that just goes to show you how little the gods really cared about the Sumerians in the minds of the Sumerians. But it also goes to show you why they would be so obsessed with trying to keep the gods happy. If you're worried that your gods might wipe you out on a whim, that would explain why they would be so concerned about making the gods happy all the time. So if you imagine, Greek and Roman gods, but Greek and Roman gods that care even less about humanity, and that are almost even spiteful towards humanity. That's kind of a good sense of what's going on here in Sumeria. As kind of a proof of that, I'll show you these statues. These are votive statues, prayer statues that the Sumerians built or created. And you can see that in these images, everybody looks like they are praying. They're all holding their hands in a little prayer pose. And the idea was if you were Sumerian, you would create a little sculpture of yourself praying and then place it in the temple so that it basically looked like you were praying to this god 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so that the god would think that, oh, look, everybody is praying to me, everybody is worshiping me, paying attention to me. I don't have to worry too much about them not liking me or not caring enough about me. But imagine, like, if you felt like you had to kind of trick your God into thinking you were worshiping them 24/7, it just goes to show you how little these gods must have cared about people in the minds of the Sumerians. It's just a really interesting little artifact that tells us something very interesting about the gods. I want to take a pause here, and we will continue in a separate video to talk about these terms here and what the afterlife was like for the Sumerians. And we will continue on talking about Sumerian civilization in that video. But for now, let's take a break.